This begins Lecture 4 in the Early Modern series, Early Modern Africa. So in the opening slide, what we're going to look at here is a large part of what we're going to talk about today is focusing on the slave trade in West Africa. It'll become a major economic, political, cultural, social movement that will impact the sub-Saharan part of Africa. So we're going to start out with West Africa. If you remember, in period 3, the post-classical period, there were several West African trade-based kingdoms. We had Ghana and Mali, and then at the end of period 3, we had the Songhai Empire, also in West Africa. So what we see, this is West Africa here, and they were controlling the trade route between the Muslims in the north and the coastal regions down here in the south, and this is where they had slaves, ivory, and gold, and the trade-based kingdoms would be the middleman between the Muslims who want all these slaves, gold, and ivory, and the people down here who want European or Muslim finished goods. And so we had Ghana and Mali in period 3, and then we finished up with Songhai. So the Songhai is just a continuation of this pattern of West African trade-based kingdoms. Here we see a specific map that shows you more of the general area of the Songhai Empire, and it's going to control this trans-Saharan trade that we have just been talking about. The Empire of Songhai is a militaristic state. They have a very powerful army and navy to safeguard these trade routes because the trade brought wealth to the kingdom, wealth brought power. And so unlike the previous two West African trade-based states, what we do see is that they do have, besides an army, they have a navy to control the Niger River traffic. And this was important to the Songhai because this is down here where they would get the slaves, and then they would bring them up the river into Timbuktu, and that would be the major trading center. And that's where the go-between is between the Muslims who were coming down here bringing European and Muslim goods, finished products, and the slave gold and ivory that was meeting here in the middle. And so they would tax that trade and become very powerful, and so control of the river was essential to their overall power structure. Next, we also see them, since the army is so important to maintain these trade routes, they had a very hierarchical army. This helps them to be organized in battle if they have their army divided into units and then they have commanders for each unit. This is something we've seen in other places in the world, but we haven't talked about it yet here in sub-Saharan Africa. Next, administration of the Songhai. Just like many places, the Songhai is divided into provinces, which makes it easier for the king to control. He appoints governors to each of these provinces who are answerable to him. The rulers and merchants will convert to Islam. We saw this in the previous two West African trade-based kingdoms of Ghana and Mali. And the reason the Songhai do this is because, again, they're trying to attract Muslim traders from the north to come and trade with them, and they figure that the Muslim traders will be more likely to trade with them if the Africans are also Muslim. And so we're going to see a continuity of Islam among the elite and the merchants in Africa at this time. To sponsor Islam, the rulers of Songhai don't force the common people to convert to Islam. That's mostly something, like I said, for the rich and the elite. But they do go ahead and the state promotes the faith. They build madrasas, or schools that teach the Quran and Arabic, and they also build mosques for people to pray in. And the common people, some of them will convert because these are nice places to pray. It's a way to move up the social structure, and so you do see some people convert. For the most part, though, it's more of an urban experience, a trade city experience for the elite and the merchants. Eventually, the Songhai Empire will decline. And they're going to decline for two reasons. The first reason is they get wealthy enough that they're going to attract Moors or Muslims from up here in the north, and they're going to be attracted by the wealth down here in the Songhai Empire. And anytime you have wealth, that's going to attract people. So they come in here and they attack the borders, and they just keep attacking and attacking. And they're able to defeat the Songhai because in period 4, the early modern period, as we've talked about, any group of people that are good at gunpowder weapons, have artillery, they're going to have an advantage. And so they had them, and the Songhai didn't really have them, even though they had this great military. And so the Songhai, that's one of the reasons they'll go into decline. Another reason they go into a decline, as you can see in the map below, is that the trans-Saharan trade going back and forth across West Africa is a long, arduous journey that's going to cross a desert about the size of the United States. in this region, and it takes a long time. But as the Europeans, the Portuguese especially, start to get better maritime technology to sail around the coast of Africa, even though in miles it's longer than the route across the desert, it takes less time and it's easier because you can carry more goods on a boat than you can on camelback. And so we'll see this is an example of a trade route disappearing from period 3 to period 4. There's just no reason to go across the desert because you can much easier go around the coast by boat because of the new maritime technology of the caravan sail, the compass, and those kinds of things. And so we see that this trade route is going to go away. And once Songhai falls, there's not going to be any more West African trade-based kingdoms to take its place. That becomes a thing of the past. Next, let's shift gears. Instead of talking about political, let's talk about cultural. Islam in West Africa. So again, a change over time. The line down the middle of the page kind of shows you this change. So previously, Islam in sub-Saharan Africa was only in trade cities. It was among the merchants and the elite, and it was syncretic. Africans tried to blend Islam with their native animistic polytheistic beliefs. And so there were Africans who were Muslim, and they would pray to Allah, but they would also believe in magic and amulets and witch doctors and divining the future, those kinds of things. However, as we go into period 4, Islam in Africa is going to change. We have a group of people called the Fulani, and they are mostly, as you can see in the picture, herders in West Africa, and they're pastoralists. And they adopt Islam because they're on these trade routes, and they fundamentally disagree with Islam the way it's been practiced in Africa. They believe that it should not be a syncretic faith, that it should be more akin to the type of Islam that is practiced in Arabia. And so they're going to try to get rid of any belief in magic and amulets and nature spirits and those kinds of things. They will replace, for the most part, the Fulani Empire will replace what we see a lot of regional kingdoms in West Africa, and they'll become the dominant power after the fall of the Songhai. And then they will work to bring Africa, regular Africans, common, ordinary Africans, not the elite, Islam. And so here's another change. In the past, Islam was for the elite and the merchants, and the Fulani are going to make it so it goes out into the countryside and it becomes the religion of the common people. And it's going to be not a syncretic faith anymore, but a faith that we drop belief in magic and amulets, like I said, and now it's going to be much more similar to traditional Islam that is practiced in Arabia. Next, let's move away from West Africa and let's now go to South Africa. In South Africa, at the start of the time period, the end of period 3, the beginning of period 4, we saw that the Dutch were moving their way around Africa, and we can see it in this map, establishing a port-based empire around Africa. And the very southern tip of Africa down here was very important to the Portuguese because that's a choke point of trade. It controls trade from West Africa to East Africa into the Indian Ocean. If you can control this, you can kind of regulate who is able to get around Africa to India. So the Portuguese, that was a very important colony to them for a long part of the time. But as the fortunes of Portugal kind of fall away in Europe and the Dutch rise to power, we're going to see that the Dutch are able to take away the ports in South Africa and control it for themselves. And so here's one change: who controls South Africa? But in addition to that, the Portuguese were there mostly to control trade, not to settle. But the Dutch do come as families to settle in South Africa. This makes them very similar to the English in North America coming as families. And just like the English in North America come as families, they're going to have conflict with the native Africans. The Dutch will come as families, and they're there to stay, and they need to feed their family, and they want to make some money, and so they open up farms and ranches, and so the Africans and the Dutch have a conflict over the resource of land. The reason Dutch families come is because the climate of South Africa is approaching the climate of Europe, and they figure that that is something similar enough that they could support families there. So the natives they run into are the Khoi, or as the Dutch call them, Hottentots, and they defeat the Khoi and drive them north or capture them and use them as slaves because the Dutch have something that the Africans don't. Once again, we see the importance of gunpowder weapons in this period. They will use the natives as a coercive labor force. They'll use them as slaves and workers on their ranches and their farms. And so we see that now South Africa has gone through a change. It's controlled not just by the Portuguese, but it's now controlled by the Dutch, with the Dutch firmly there, staying, establishing families, and on top of the social structure, and the native Africans on the bottom of the social structure. And this model will continue for a long time in South Africa, well into period 6. So now we're going to switch to East Africa. At the end of period 3, we had talked about the Swahili city-states. Arabs who had gone to the east coast of Africa on the Indian Ocean and used those the Swahili city-states as ports, right? When the most one we talked about is Zanzibar right here. And in Zanzibar, they had used that city as a go-between between the inside of Africa, where they can find gold, ivory, and slaves, and the Indian Ocean, which had finished goods and products. And so once again, the Swahili were functioning as a middleman between the inside of Africa here and the Indian Ocean here, and Zanzibar was the middle. However, with all this wealth, it's going to attract, at the beginning of period 4, it's going to attract the Portuguese. So the Portuguese are going to come in and they're going to conquer the Swahili states, and they can do this because they have, once again, artillery and gunpowder weapons, and they will take over the Swahili city-states, and so the Portuguese will be in control of East Africa for a while. And again, the European model is not to share but to control trade, and they try to do this with their gunpowder weapons. So we see a change over time here as the destruction of the Swahili city-states to be replaced by the Portuguese. Next, African slave trade in the Atlantic Ocean. So now that we've talked about West Africa, South Africa, and East Africa as it revolves around trade around the continent of Africa, let's now focus our economic shift our economic focus, to talking about the African slave trade. If you remember, in period 3, there was African slave trade, and Africans were primarily taken from East Africa to go work on the sugar plantations of Arabs in Mesopotamia. But now in period 4, we're going to see that the African slave trade is now going to move west into the Atlantic. Remember, if we're going to do a link here, a world link, we have all of that sugar being produced in the Caribbean and in Brazil, and there's a need for Africans to go in that direction. So that's a definite demographic change from period 3 to period 4. So let's talk about the Kingdom of Congo. The Kingdom of Congo is purple on this map. It's located right on the equator, and it's heavily populated, and there's a bunch of small little tribes that are constantly fighting and competing with each other. But then as the Portuguese arrive, they need African slaves to work their sugar plantations in Brazil and also the Azores and the Canary Islands. And so when the Portuguese show up, they make contact with the coastal Africans, and they promise them trade goods, modern trade goods, if the African coastal tribes will give them slaves. And so we see once again, we see this model of a middleman. The tribal coastal Africans, the Congolese, they will go into the interior and capture Africans, bring them to the coast, and trade them with the Europeans for modern weapons, guns, iron, steel, those kinds of things. And so we see that the Congolese are actually getting very wealthy being the middleman between the Portuguese and the inside of Africa. The Kingdom of Congo, like I said, is going to become very powerful, and they're going to use this trade with the Europeans to equip themselves with guns. Once they do that, then they can dominate all their other African neighbors, and it becomes the dominant African state in the region. So here we see in the picture the Portuguese coming to the king of the Congo, and they're coming there, and they're saying, look, we'd like to trade with you. In the background, you can see that there are slaves that are being gathered, but also we'll see that just like every place else in the world, the Portuguese are bringing Catholicism with them. And so the Congolese, the king of Congo and his top officials are going to convert to Catholicism to try to encourage the Portuguese to continue to come to the Congo and trade with them for slaves. And so this is a similarity that we saw in other places as well, where we had talked about how in the Muslim world in period 3, people had converted to Islam to attract Islamic merchants, and now we're seeing Africans convert on the coast in sub-Saharan Africa to Christianity, Catholicism, to attract slave traders. Now we're going to talk about the decline of the Congo. The Congolese will control this slave trade for quite a while, and they realize that the Portuguese have become so dependent on their slaves that they can start to charge high prices. They know that the Portuguese need slaves for their sugar plantations, and Congo is the main supplier of those slaves. And so the king of the Congo, just he realizes he has a kind of monopoly here, and so he starts to charge high prices for his slaves. And the Portuguese don't want to do this, and so they start to look for different ways to find slaves, and they move further down the coast to a new area of Africa, which lessens the demand for slaves, and the Congolese start to lose their money that they're making off of the controlling the slave trade with the Europeans, and they eventually fall as other African kingdoms will take their place because the new African kingdoms will be trading with the Portuguese instead of Congo. So we now have the kingdom of Ndongo or Angola. So as I said, it's further down the coast. And so when the prices are too high up here in Congo, the Portuguese just slide down the coast and they start trading with Africans along the coast here, who once again will see the same thing happen. The Africans in Angola will go into the interior of Africa, bring slaves back to the coast for the Portuguese. When they do this, it pretty much cuts out the Congolese. They're not getting any more trade. And so, like I said, they fall apart. And so Angola is very similar to the story of Congo. Local elite will convert to Catholicism, just like they did in the Congo. So again, we see that Christianity is spreading because of the slave trade. We can see in the bottom picture that Africans are converting and they're praying to this cross because they hope that if they convert to Catholicism, again, the Portuguese will be more likely to trade with them than people in the Congo. As this is going on, though, once again, we see history kind of repeat itself. The king of Angola realizes that the Portuguese are dependent on him for slaves, and so he starts to raise his prices. Now, the Portuguese don't want to keep sliding further down the coast, and they get kind of sick of this. So the Portuguese decide that they are going to just take over control of the coast of Africa and cut out the middlemen, as it were, and they will be more directly responsible for capturing slaves and instead of having a middleman, they'll be their own middleman. And so the Portuguese take over Angola. This makes it a first in European history. It's the first permanent European colony in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's going to remain that way well into period 6. So the Portuguese are going to stay in Angola for a long time because they don't want to give up their control of the slave trade. Now, of course, the Angolans are not happy about this. They try to resist the Portuguese taking over control of their country, and Queen Nzinga is famous for leading a rebellion against the Portuguese to try to stop them from taking over her country, but she's unsuccessful once again because the Portuguese have access to more gunpowder weapons than she does, and so she loses. Next, we're going to move on to one of the most important historical events in this time period. It's the triangular trade, and take a moment to look on the map to familiarize yourself with what's going on in the trade and where it is. So let's go through this trade route. So we'll start in Africa. As we have talked about, slaves come from Africa, and then the Europeans will transport them across the ocean to the Caribbean and also, of course, to Brazil, as we've talked about before. So these boats loaded with human beings are transported across the Atlantic Ocean. They unload their human cargo, and they replace their ship's cargo with cash crops, sugar, rice, tobacco, those kinds of things. So they pick up raw materials in the New World, and then they take those raw materials to Europe. As we have talked about on a previous set of notes, in Europe, they're using these raw materials as part of the commercial revolution to produce more and more finished goods. Once they have those finished goods, the boats are filled up with those finished goods and then taken back to Africa, and that's where we once again complete the triangle. We unload our boats full of European finished goods for African slaves, and the triangle repeats itself year after year, voyage after voyage. This is known as the triangular trade. The most important part of the triangular trade for our purposes today is the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is the point in the triangular trade from Africa to the New World when the boats are loaded full of human slaves that have been captured from Africa and being taken to the New World. As you can imagine, the conditions on these boats were horrible. The European slave traders were paid by the slave, and so they have an economic incentive to load as many Africans on that boat as possible, to pack them as tight as they can. The more Africans they get across the Atlantic to the plantations, the more money they'll make. And so we see year after year Um, Thousands upon hundreds of thousands of Africans are taken across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa to the New World. And this is an example of migration on a very large scale. And we see, again, changes both in Africa and in the New World because of this slave triangle. Next, the impact on Africa. What was the impact of the slave trade on Africa? Well, you might be tempted to think that the population of Africa is going to decrease, but that is not the case. Oddly enough, the population of Africa increases in period 4, even though they're having hundreds of thousands of human beings pulled out of their country against their will. The reason for this is because Africans just gain access to the Columbian Exchange. Maize, yams, uh, peanuts, all as well as other crops. They make their way to Africa. So New World crops are going to make their way to Africa, which gives Africans a more varied diet, more sources of calorie. And so their population explodes even as far as going over the loss from the slave trade. Next, we're going to see a gender imbalance in Africa. As you can imagine, these human beings are taken as slaves to go to the New World to work on plantations. And so the slave catchers want men more than women. Men on average tend to be bigger and stronger than women. And so we're going to see that there's a gender imbalance in Africa. There's more women than men because of the slave trade. This has an impact on society. Because there are so few men around, and there is an abundance of women, we're going to see that the practice of polygamy increases in Africa, marrying more than one wife. The reason this is because if you're a woman and you don't have a chance to get married, you have nobody to protect you, you have nobody to provide for you, you have no partner to help grow crops with and also raise children. And so what we see is that women are more and more going to be a surplus, and so their option is either to stay single or to marry a man with another wife. And so we see that increase in Africa. But because of that, because we have one husband with multiple wives, we're going to see that it becomes a much more patriarchal society. Because now, when there's ever a surplus of something, its value goes down in economic terms. But we can also apply that to society. Now that this husband doesn't have just one wife, he has many wives, he doesn't have to treat that one wife with as much respect, or he can control her more, if you want to look at it a different way. Because he has other wives that can take up the slack if she is mad at him. And so we can see that the husband becomes the center of the family, and these wives, they become less valuable in the husband-wife relationship because we see a man just has more control over the family. And so the status of women goes down somewhat at this time from what it was before. In addition to that, women take on more traditional male jobs. In the past, men and women would farm together, but for the most part, it was a man's job, and then the women would raise the children, cook the food, those kinds of things. But now we see women have to go out into the field and help raise food for the family. And so we see in this picture here, a woman is not just doing her domestic chores, but she's also helping take care of the family as well. So work roles change in Africa as a result of the slave trade. And then just like we saw in New France and the New World in North America, intertribal violence is going to go up as African tribes along the coast compete with each other to trade with the Portuguese. That's going to increase intertribal violence. Let's say you're tribe A and you want to trade with the Portuguese, and tribe B does too. Well, the way to get the Portuguese to trade with just you and not tribe B is to kill off tribe B. In addition to that, warfare becomes much more violent because Africans get access to gunpowder weapons, and they didn't have that before. And then finally, Africans are also encouraged to go and raid Africans in the interior to bring back more slaves for the coast. And so we see that just like the fur trade in North America, we see intertribal warfare increases because of the slave trade in Africa. So if we kind of summarize this a little bit, the African slave trade was, of course, a horrible thing that Africans experienced, but it wasn't horrible for all Africans. Many Africans were wrenched from their families and taken across the ocean to a new continent, and then they would see their families again or die on the trip. But other Africans, especially Africans along the coast, benefited greatly because of the slave trade, getting wealth and power and gunpowder weapons as a result of the trade. So let's talk about Africans. Once they've crossed the Atlantic Ocean, they've left Africa. What is the African experience in the New World? So we can see in this map, and as we also talked about on a previous slideshow, Most Africans are going to be taken to the Caribbean and also Brazil to grow sugar. Very few are going to go to the mainland of North America. Once in the New World, it was typical for African families to be unloaded from their boats and then be purposely separated from their families. Plantation owners wanted to do this so that it would be harder for the new arrivals to plan a rebellion or to try to run away because they couldn't communicate with any of the other slaves. These slaves, remember, were being taken from many different parts of Africa, from many different tribes, and so they typically couldn't communicate with each other. So families would be purposely separated to cut down on slave rebellions and running away. Next, we have a new coercive labor term here. It's called chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is different than traditional slavery. In traditional slavery, which we saw in the Roman Empire or other places, it wasn't race-based, and slaves eventually could own their own slaves or rise in social status or even get out of slavery. That is not the case here for slavery in the New World. Slaves are going to be treated as slaves for their entire lives, and their children will be slaves, and so forth and so on. Also, they can be bought and sold. They're not tied to the land, and it's race-based. If you're of darker skin color in the Americas, odds are you're probably a slave. And so we see that American slavery is going to be different than slavery that we see in other parts of the world. So did the slaves just acquiesce to this, or did they ever rebel? Of course they did, but there's different ways to rebel, which we've talked about the same thing Native Americans did to European rule in a previous PowerPoint. Here we see that some African Americans on the plantations will work slow. And this is kind of a cumulative thing. If you continue to work slow year after year after year, then your owner starts to lower his expectations, and he thinks that you can only get done a little bit of work in a day instead of what you could actually do more. And so this is a form of resistance. Another form of resistance is to act dumb. If your owner tells you to do A, B, and C that day, and you're like, I don't understand, I only understand the first thing you told me, then it's another way of him to lower expectations of you, and so you have at the end of the day to do fewer things. That is another form of resistance. Next, to break tools. When your owner's not looking, you break the axle on the cart, somehow your tool gets lost or broken, and you can't work that day. And so all of these are kind of under the surface ways of rebelling against your owner, so you don't have as much work to do that he wants you to do in that day. The next one is to run away. Africans in the Caribbean or in Brazil or even in North America sometimes were able to run away and go live in the swamp or up in the mountains, deep in the forest. And this is where their white owners couldn't find them. And so they established what we call maroon communities, a community that is just made up of African Americans. And sometimes they would go ahead and intermingle with Native Americans, and they would live in their own lives in their own established communities without white Caucasian presence in the area. There was rebellions, but it was very rare. There are some slave rebellions we will talk about in the future, but they're very rare because the Europeans own all the guns, they have all the wealth and power, and so it's very rare that they succeed, which means Africans will typically not do it. You're not going to rebel if you know you have a very little chance of succeeding. You might resist in other ways mentioned. Next, Africans in the New World as far as their religion goes. Well, as we had talked about in the past, in Africa there are various religions. We see that in West Africa there were lots of Muslims as they were trying to trade with the Arabs coming across the trans-Saharan trade. Along the coast, lots of Africans were Christians to try to increase trade along with slave traders. And then inside of Africa, the further inland you go away from the coast, most Africans were animistic. They believed in nature spirits. So what happens to African religion as they are going to be brought to the New World under European supervision? What we're going to see is a new faith emerge. It's a syncretic faith again. It's a blending of two faiths, and you take a little bit of what you like from each. And this new syncretic faith is called Vodun or Voodoo. It's a blending of Christianity and belief in magic and spirits and amulets. And so we see as an example here we have this voodoo doll, and the belief is that if you construct this voodoo doll in the shape of somebody that you don't like, you could put pins or needles in them or put spells on them, and that'll affect the real person. But also you notice that this voodoo doll is in the shape of a cross. And so this is a good example, I think, of this syncretic faith, blending ideas of Christianity with ideas of animism and spirits. In addition to that, we see what's known as Creole language. Creole language is a blending of a European language and many African dialects. So let's say that you're on a plantation and there are maybe 10 different tribes that are represented on that plantation from Africa. Those African languages will start to blend, plus whatever language the owner of the plantation speaks to you. And so that's Creole. It's a syncretic language. The most famous one in North America is going to be called Gula. So that would be a specific example you could put down. And I've shown you a list of English words and what they may be translated to in Gula. And so sometimes they're similar, sometimes they're not. Or on the bottom left-hand side, you could see the Lord's Prayer from Christianity that is going to be changed a little bit to blend with some African words. And so we see as this syncretic language. And that ends our slideshow for today.